Welcome back, everyone. If you are here, we're going to do a quick movement exercise. It's 2 minutes, which I'm going to lead just to get some energy back into our bodies. So if you'd like, I invite you to stand up. You can put on your videos if you'd like. You can also stay seated, whatever you're comfortable with. I'm going to stand up because I love dancing. I was the person that put on their video in the connections exercise. And I am going to play some music by one of my favorite queer artists right now, named Kitty Smile, Be Honest. Can you all hear that? Yeah? Okay. So we're just gonna do a follow me. So just kind of get into your body for a second. I love all the dancing. Get into your body. And what we're gonna do first is we're gonna start by taking a bucket and we're gonna wash those old stories away that don't serve us, okay? So take that bucket and wash those old stories away. We don't need them anymore, okay? And I want you to wipe it clean with both of your hands. You can do big strokes, you can do little strokes. I'm really good at it. And I want you to write a compassionate mantra or maybe your catchphrase on the wall. Think about it. You are beautiful. I am worthy. I am lovable. And try to take that in right now. All right, we're gonna do a freestyle, so you can do anything you want. Do anything you want. Just like let it go. And you're going to take your arms, spread them very wide, as comfortably as you can. And you're going to embrace everyone and yourself in my giant hug. Just reach over, squeeze. Now everybody high five everyone. High five everyone. High five your neighbors. Do your biggest celebration move. Hopefully to get some twirls in there. Whew. Okay, y'all, you did some work. I'm loving it. Oh my gosh, I was feeling that. I was feeling all that energy. You all are amazing. Hope you got some energy, some blood flowing. I definitely do. Okay, so hopefully you're in your body. We've got some energy back, some attention. We can take that all towards the next panel. So I'm going to turn it to our moderator, who's Allison Briscoe-Smith. She's a senior fellow at the Greater Good Science Center, and she's also teaching the next generation of therapists as a professor at the Wright Institute. So she'll kick off our next panel and introduce our panelists. And thanks for dancing with me, y'all. That was so fun.
Hey, mahalo, Scott. Thank you so much. Thanks so much for this introduction. I'm really looking forward to this next section. So just a brief introduction to myself. My name is Allison Briscoe-Smith, and I'm a senior fellow here at GGSC. And I'm also a child clinical psychologist, and as Scott mentioned, a professor at the Wright. So we had a great panel before by Professors Mason and Powell, who really kicked us off to actually start beginning to talk about contact. They mentioned contact, and Professor Powell in particular raised up this idea around how physical segregation actually supports polarization. And then both Professor Powell and Mason really complicated it. It's not just a matter of contact. It's hierarchy, social status, superordinate goal. So that's where we're going to kind of go today, is to try to elucidate and complicate those concepts a bit, in particular here in this kind of still engaged COVID world, but also as we kind of look to the future. So our main kind of question that we're going to be addressing today is, once you've established contact, what can we do to really build on it and really try to continue to build these differences? So that's what our esteemed panel is going to be talking about today. So I'm just going to briefly introduce them. And then start with a couple rounds of questions. As usual, it seems as if you all are pretty adept at the chat function as I see it scrolling by. So keep those coming. We'll be taking a look at the questions and bringing you all into dialogue after our guests get a chance to kind of talk in the beginning. So the first of our guests I'm going to introduce is Dr. Emile Bruneau. He is the director of Peace and Conflict and Neuroscience Lab at the University of Pennsylvania. His research really focuses on characterizing the psychological and cognitive processes that drive intergroup conflict and hostility, and building interventions that actually circumvent these processes to promote peace. So prior to his formal training, he spent a lot of time and lived in the places that had all this high conflict. So living in South Africa during the transition to apartheid, in Sri Lanka during one of the largest Tamil Tiger strikes, and also living in Ireland during the Troubles, Israel and Palestine around the Second Intifada. So, again, he's bringing together lived experiences and research as well. The next person that we're also going to be highlighting is Eboo Patel. He's the founder and president of the Interfaith Youth Corps, which is a nonprofit organization that is working to make interfaith cooperation a social norm in America. He's the author of many books, articles, has spoken prolifically, served on President Obama's inaugural Faith Council, and has really just done a lot to engage this conversation and invigorate it and pull it into action. And he also is a regular participator and author for the blog on Inside Higher Ed. I see we have a lot of educators today on conversations on diversity. Our last guest in this panel is Amanda Ripley. She is a contributing writer to Atlantic and a senior fellow at the Emerson Collective. She is a prolific author. The book that I want to talk about is the Unthinkable: Who Survives Disaster When Strikes? Who survives when disaster strikes and why? Maybe there's some tips for us in the midst of that. But actually, what we're going to be focusing on is her other work. She's been working quite a lot to examine and to think about the toxic lure, the lure of toxic conflicts, about why they're so compelling, and how some people actually manage to break free from their spell. She again has done a lot of writing and shared her stories and the understanding of others with many, whether it's through the New York Times, Washington Post, or correspondence, a lot. So we have a lot to kind of benefit from her as well. So those are our three guests, and I'm going to begin by turning it to you, Dr. Bruneau. The first question I really want to ask is that one thing that we really appreciate about your work is that it really complicates a lot of the ideas that we hear about why we're so divided, about how to bridge differences. So, for example, there's this conventional wisdom of like walk a mile in another person's shoes, this kind of perspective taking. But you say that there's some truth to that, but also it's more complicated. So can you tell us a little bit about what you found, a chance to talk about kind of perspective taking versus perspective giving?
Yeah. So before I was a scientist, I was a teacher in high school and elementary school. And in high school, I took part in a lot of the Multicultural Alliance work, the Indian Club, the Asian Club. And we sponsored a lot of dialogue programs, basically students from marginalized groups talking with white students. And what I really saw, and what the students, especially the students, the Black students, the Asian students, what they expressed to me was, well, this is great. We get together, we get to kind of educate some white students for a while, but 2 weeks later, nothing's changed. We don't feel any different at the school. And I started hearing very similar things from students from other groups, Israeli and Palestinian kids who were brought together for these programs. The Palestinian kids would say to me is, same thing, this is great, we get to make some Israeli friends, but a week later, I'm still getting harassed as I go through a checkpoint. My life hasn't changed, the system is still the same. And I think I really started wondering what students from marginalized groups were getting out of these contact environments, and there's an assumption in these programs, like the program I volunteered at in Ireland. There's an assumption that you need to have parity in all things, that the Israeli students and the Palestinian students, that the Catholic and the Protestant kids all had to kind of do the same thing, that it had to treat everybody equally. And although I really appreciated that sentiment, things aren't usually equal when you have conflict between groups. There's usually a power imbalance between the groups. And by denying that, I thought it was a disservice to at least half the kids in the program. And so my prediction was that perspective taking is a great activity if you're a member like me of a majority group who might be unfamiliar with the minority group's perspective. Right? It gives me something new. My group has control over the media. My group has control over the news. So I generally get the white perspective on what's going on. And people from marginalized groups in my society also get the white perspective on everything. You know, that my Black students would tell me that they have to be bicultural growing up. They know what it's like to be white in America, and they know what it's like to be Black in America. And so by taking their perspective, I really feel like I could benefit. I could understand the world in more nuanced ways, in ways that were a reality for people who didn't look like me. But I really started wondering whether the opposite was true. Were they getting anything from me expressing my view? I feel like they were exposed to that all the time. How could taking my perspective help them in any way? My first prediction was that perspective taking in these situations is only really a benefit for members of the empowered or the dominant group, and that it wouldn't do much for members of the non-dominant group. And what I thought might be more effective for people from marginalized groups was actually just being given the opportunity to speak and be listened to by someone from the majority group. And so this is what I tested in my research. I tested it with Israelis and Palestinians, and I also tested it with white Americans and Mexican immigrants. And what I did is I just set them up into these dialogue situations, and I assigned them roles. Their role was either to be the speaker and talk about, the challenges in their life and the challenges faced by people from their community. And the other person's role was just to listen and to reflect back what they heard at the end. So one person played the speaker and the other the listener. One was engaged in perspective taking, the other one was engaged in perspective giving. And I found that it was pretty clear for both of these groups that white Americans, their attitudes towards Mexican immigrants improved quite a bit if they were listening, but nothing happened if they were speaking and being listened to. And the same thing was true for Israelis and Palestinians. If Israelis were listening to Palestinians speak, their attitudes towards Palestinians improved. But if they were doing the speaking, it didn't do much. And the opposite was true for members of the marginalized or non-dominant group. That for them, being able to speak and be listened to was the thing that improved their attitudes. So that was that was the work that I did, looking at this at the important interaction that group power has in the effectiveness of interventions. And there's other really wonderful work showing that these types of dialogue interventions can actually backfire for members of the marginalized group. That support for collective action to change things by members of a marginalized group actually takes a hit if you successfully run a program and those members of the marginalized group kind of stop blaming white people in general and start saying, well, they're okay, they don't really mean it. They start accepting the status quo more. So not only is this type of activity not very helpful for members of the marginalized group, but it might sap their will to change things. So it might be counterproductive as well. And I just think that these things are, this is important to keep in mind, especially because it goes counter to our intuitions. There are a lot of dialogue programs out there, and I don't know if any of them take this into account. I think they all are so focused on equity within the framework of the interaction that, I think they might ultimately have a negative effect.
I mean, so you've really helped to continue to complicate this idea, and I think raise up something that was talked about in the previous session, which is around storytelling. But underneath the storytelling is what I'm hearing is that story listening is really important, how we can listen. So I think you've pointed us to that. We're going to be able to kind of come back and talk more about that, but thank you. I'm
Yeah.
going to transition next to Eboo. Eboo, you and your interfaith youth corps have been working with leaders on hundreds of college campuses over the past 20 plus years to help them, foster dialogue, as we've talking about, perhaps listening and cooperation. So now with college campuses closed, you've had to reimagine this work. And I think many of us are asking the question, how do we connect when now all I really have to do is stay at home? As you've made that shift, what do you see as a key practical insight from your prior work that feels really key for us to preserve in this time? So, what's a key principle for positive dialogue and, again, positive listening and understanding that's been central to IFYC's work so far that could be applied to other contexts, even beyond interfaith dialogue?
Yeah, thank you, Allison, and thanks to everybody who's here. Thank you for the dancing, Scott. It's a powerful circle, and I'm very proud to be a part of it. So I think that there is an electricity in humankind that continues, and I would say what that is the desire to contribute, regardless of the format. And all of us have a desire to contribute. And I think that there's a distinctive desire in young people. I think it was probably best expressed by Gwendolyn Brooks. She writes in this beautiful piece, "I shall create, if not a note, a whole, if not an overture, a desecration." And what I find so powerful about that is this sense of, look, I'm going to have an impact, right? I have a 10 and a 13-year-old, and I promise you, like they have this like thoroughbreds racing through their heart, almost need to have an impact, to whether it's going to be a note or a whole, or an overture or a desecration. And I think that there's a dimension of that happens when we're in a physical space together. There's a power to that, but it doesn't go away when we're not together. And the question is how do we shape more overtures and fewer desecrations? And so IFYC is the organization that I lead, which deals principally with religious diversity and young people in the format of residential college campuses. We want to take that cosmic energy and do what we can to channel it in positive directions in this crazy time. And so we actually have a concrete initiative that we have shaped that I want to kind of give liftoff to today. If we could just, I think it's Tom who is our tech whiz. If Tom or whoever the tech whiz is could pull up the slides and actually go straight to slide 5, 10,000 bridge builders. And just share that. Look, I think a huge part of what's happening right now is actually it's a couple slides earlier. It's slide 5 there. A huge part of what's happening now is our plans for education and employment have been profoundly disrupted, right? And this is going to go on for a long time in some format. It's not like 2 weeks. How do we just get through this, right? There's going to be some version of this for 6 months, 9 months, 12 months, 15 months, who knows how long. What does it look like to have the endurance of hope in this time? What does it look like to turn a very unwelcome idleness in some cases? I mean, in many cases, people are working harder than ever. And in some cases, people's big plans that they've been hoping for 5 or 8 or 10 years, educational plans, employment plans, I mean, kaput, right? And there's like this unwelcome idleness. How do we channel that into idealism? We know that pandemics in history have led to exclusion and tribalism. How do we promote acts of service across lines of difference? And so part of what we want to do at IFYC is just be really practical and say, what if we created an initiative that offered a wide group of people an initial opportunity to engage in acts of kindness across lines of difference? So we're calling this 10,000 Bridge Builders, and you all are the first people we are talking to publicly about this since we've been cooking it up at IFYC. So I'm super curious to see what you all think. So we'll go to the next slide, please, slide 6. As I said, what we've got here is this idea of an unwelcome idleness for at least a set of young people. How do we move that to idealism? And the beauty is that we're seeing parts of this right now, like people from different backgrounds making masks together, people, running We Got Us and mutual aid campaigns. How are we able to continue this ladder for time to come, for the months that are ahead? So let's go to the next slide. So here's the big idea. We would like to create a badge, an educational module that leads to a 10,000 Bridge Builders badge, which lives on this awesome educational platform called LRNG. And you go through this, you do a short reflection exercise on what inspires you to be a bridge builder, which is to say to engage in active service across lines of difference. You do a connect exercise, which connects you to people and theologies and identities of people who are different from you, who are also inspired by their Jewish faith, their Muslim faith, their atheism, to do active service across lines of difference. And you're connected to historical periods. The work of Lillian Wall during the pandemic of 1918 and 1919. I'll talk about her in more detail in the next go around, but she's a Jewish woman who starts this amazing thing called community nursing. You go through this, you do your active service, you get a badge, and it's a step down the path of being a bridge builder. We don't think that this is just for 10,000 people. We think this could be for 10 million people. And we've put together a half-baked cake of a video. It's if we can move the slides forward a little bit, it's about 90 seconds. We'd love to just roll this video and see what you think. And as I said, think of this as a half-baked cake. You'll get some of the flavor without the full production value, but this is what we're going for, this kind of energy and this kind of action. And we're looking for not just 10,000, but 10 million. So here we go.
We come from all over the world, carrying with us our history, our legacies, our stories, our ancestors and practices we've maintained for generations or created ourselves. We are orthodox and atheist and everything in between. We are searching and spiritual and trying to figure it out. We are civically minded. And when we look at what's happening in society, we think maybe we can help. We have faith in ourselves, our families, our communities, and because we imagine a world that is different, a world that is more kind and compassionate, we know we can create one, especially when we come together, when we call on the homies, our friends and neighbors, when we gather to work, when the many assemble as one for the betterment of all. Like those who have inspired us, they came from somewhere. They were young people with big visions the world said was impossible. And yet they acted. They were brave and outrageous. They did things that had not been done. They uplifted themselves and those around them to create something more equitable and more just. The Interfaith Youth Corps engages emerging leaders on college campuses across the country in conversations and actions that steer broad cultural change. And it starts with you and your story in conversation with others like you and not like you. A growing understanding of our difference and similarities that create pathways towards empathy and action that broaden our sense of who we are and who we are in connection to others. One nation diverse, one nation indivisible. This is an invitation to become a bridge builder, one of 10, of 10,000, of 10 million, and connect the world.
I mean, that sounds like a pretty well-baked cake to me. So thank you for sharing, and also a moment for us to kind of think about hope. There's been such a conversation that we've leveraged so far about the outcome of a bad outcome is not necessarily inevitable. There are ways to move this. So thank you for sharing that. We're going to be able to kind of come back and hear more from you about this work. I want to turn now to Amanda, and I think this is a nice kind of step. Amanda, your work has really focused more recently on, lessons of deeply listening, and expanding and complicating issues. So I want to have you talk a little bit more about that. You've written about techniques that journalists can learn from mediators, from religious leaders, and others who are trying to bridge partisan divides, promote deeper understanding between groups, rather than just kind of coming back to reinforce the differences. So most folks in our audience today aren't necessarily journalists and more likely to work in education or healthcare or nonprofit. But we're wondering, what are some of the lessons that you've taken away from this work that can be helpful as we kind of are moving this conversation more concretely into how do we move into action? So Amanda, can you talk about that a little bit?
Sure. Yeah. Thank you. Before I do that, I want to just point something out based on what Eboo was just talking about. I mean, we're at this really strange moment, almost frozen in time, where we know that humans tend to, as we've talked about, sort the world into in-groups and out-groups, right? And we know that there are lots of reasons for that, and there's lots of problems with that. But we also know that certain events can really disrupt that, can trigger a sudden reshuffling of those identities. And Dr. Powell alluded to how dynamic these things can be and can allow us to really broaden the definition of in-group. And so I think this is the time to do like an interfaith youth corps and other big ideas like that, because things are, you mentioned my first book, which was about human behavior and disasters. And so I do think about that a lot now. I write about that, right? I'm going back to that, sort of like a flashback. But there's a moment during and after a disaster where things are sort of molten, where things can be shaped. And we are seeing things be shaped for good and for ill, right, in this moment. One of the challenges, as I think a lot about as a journalist, is which people we focus the lens on at moments like this, because we feel like we have to cover extremist organizations for good reason. And how do you cover them without normalizing them, without making them seem bigger and more powerful than they are? David Brooks had a column yesterday about the gap, right, between how most Americans are responding to this crisis, which is actually with unbelievable grace in most cases, and the way that it looks when you read the paper, right? And there's this pain that I think a lot of us feel viscerally when we try to read the news right now. And it's important to read these stories because they're also true, right? But trying to calibrate that in our heads is really challenging. So going back to your question, I think for me, the 2016 election really left me quite disoriented. I felt like journalism, this thing that I devoted 20 years of my life to, seemed really broken. And, half the country did not trust the places I wrote for to tell the truth. So then what? It seemed like a lot of my colleagues, friends who I respect and admire, they were just more certain about their role as truth tellers than ever. So a lot of journalists just sort of doubled down, particularly at the national level, doubled down on what they were always doing. But it seemed to me like that wasn't going to work, right? So I found it, as anyone who has had to break up with an identity or gone through a rough spot with your identity, I found it incredibly difficult to reconcile, like the ways journalism was not functioning and the role that I played in that. So with support from a nonprofit called the Solutions Journalism Network, I sort of got off the ride for a while and I've actually spent the last few years really with people who do conflict differently than journalists, like a lot of people here today. People from groups like Resetting the Table, from Over Zero, from gang violence interrupters at Chicago Cred, mediators. I did a ton of conflict mediation training, which was literally the best journalism training I never got. And discovered that there's a lot that journalists don't understand about conflict, even though we consider it the way painters consider paint. Like we consider conflict integral to storytelling. But one of the things that I realized is that there's like a state at which conflict becomes high conflict. which I think of as a time when conflict clarifies, becoming almost too clear, and there's an us and a them and a good and an evil. And the usual ways of communicating just don't work in that context. So doing normal journalism is not only, I mean, it's either irrelevant or destructive, right, in most cases. So that, of course, begs the question, okay, what then? Like, what does work? What kinds of communication do work? And that's where people like Emile's work has been so helpful to me. Another really valuable place that I went on this sort of listening tour was a place at Columbia University called the Difficult Conversations Lab, which is run by Peter Coleman and his colleagues. And this is a place that literally arranges for the awkward, tense conversations that you never want to have, and records them and studies them. And they've done over 500 of these over the past 10 years, inspired by the Love Lab in Seattle by the Gottmans. And they've learned a lot of really interesting things about these conversations. So they pair up strangers who have very different opinions on some kind of hot button topic. And they basically realized that, they could sort all these conversations they recorded into two categories, roughly speaking. One were the conversations that got stuck, which is to say, kind of mired in anger and frustration and blame. And some of those conversations, as you might imagine, had to be ended before the 20 minutes was up. But then there were these other conversations where people did experience anger and frustration and blame, but they cycled out of those emotions and experienced other emotions as well. So they experienced moments of curiosity, of humor, of understanding, and they asked more questions. So there was just like a galaxy of emotion as opposed to just a tightrope, if that makes sense. And I realized that that's actually what my job is, right? Is to revive curiosity in a time of polarization and to create that galaxy of emotion to the degree we can, right? Because I think, and people can disagree, and I hope they do, that what journalists are supposed to do is to help people understand themselves or each other or the world a little bit better, right? And so in a time of high conflict, that requires different things, different skills, different strategies. So one of the things they, and then I'll stop talking, but one of the things they found is that you could induce these more dynamic, flexible conversations, which, by the way, people left the lab much more satisfied after having, and they could induce them by priming people for curiosity. So it turns out, people are susceptible, right? We all are. So before they went in to have their awkward conversations with strangers, they had people separated into two groups, a treatment group and a control group. And the control group read a traditional news story about some kind of controversial issue, say abortion. And the traditional news story, you've all read these, where they have one person on the pro-abortion side and one person on the anti-abortion side. And it's just sort of ping pongs back and forth. And then the other news story, which was the same length and had roughly the same facts in it, was much more nuanced. And it said, there's actually not, among Americans, there's a huge spectrum of opinions on this. Some people feel this way, some people feel that way. Many people aren't sure how to feel about it. They feel conflicted. They feel they answer differently if the poll question is asked differently. And you just kind of hold that tension in the story as opposed to reducing it, right? And the people who read that more complex news story went on to have more complex conversations that were more dynamic, more fluid, and more helpful. So I think that for the rest of us, what that means is that we all kind of have two chords in us when it comes to conflict. One chord is the chord of us versus them, othering, discord, competition. And as a country, we've gotten really good at playing that note, right? And provoking that. And I think a lot of our institutions are designed, right, to do that. And a lot of our platforms. But we also have the chord of curiosity, cooperation, collaboration, right? And that also can be incited. And there are ways to incite it and to provoke it. And so we know that the interesting thing about COVID is you feel both of those, right? You can feel them both. On the one hand, some guy came to my door the other day and he wasn't wearing a mask and I didn't know who he was and he was like right in my face. And I was like, dude, please. So there was a real kind of pushing away feeling. And at the other hand, I really wanted to be helpful to him. Like he needed work, and I get that. And so there's this duality that's maybe never or rarely been more present in many billions of people at the same time. So there's real opportunity in that.
I really appreciate how you brought us to this place of kind of focusing on both of these chords, right? So both of these kinds of opportunities. And what we're going to kind of go next is I think Eboo is going to kind of continue to talk about this latter chord of curiosity, openness, engagement. And then Emile, I'm going to put you on the first chord just to kind of talk about, again, some of the science underneath why it is that we pull to those places. So Emile, you've got these really fascinating findings that can suggest ways that we break vicious cycles of hate and dehumanization. We've invoked that idea, but when that chord goes too far, then we can't see the other and we don't have to see them anymore because they're not human. But you've been examining this and you found that partisan divides are based not just on how we think about the other side, but how we think they think about us. Right, we saw that actually up front too. Can you tell us a little bit more about that work and those implications? So we'll focus on you with that. We'll move to a question from Eboo, come back to Amanda, and then open it up.
Okay. Yeah. Great. So this idea is just that we're motivated not just about how we feel about the other group, but how we think they think of us. And this is in interpersonal interactions, this is referred to as mentalizing or theory of mind. It's something that we humans are obsessed with. We always want to know what somebody else is thinking, and in particular what they're thinking about us. So do they think I'm smart? Are they bored? Do they like it? Do they like me? So we do this reflexively all the time. We have neural real estate. If you take your finger on your right ear and you move it up 2 inches and back 2 inches, underneath there is a brain region that's dedicated to this activity, to trying to understand what other people are thinking, and in particular, what they're thinking about us. And this is really relevant in group contexts. We want to know what the other group thinks about our group. And psychologists have termed this meta perception. So not my perceptions of them, but what I think their perceptions of us are. And I've found that these are incredibly relevant, especially between political partisans. And whereas my personal, if I'm interacting with someone else, I kind of have an optimism bias. I think they have access to my mind. They know what I know. When it's with groups, we have a pessimism bias. We think that other group members think worse of us than they actually do. So this is the tendency in intergroup relationships, and it's turned out to be incredibly relevant for political partisans. So we have looked at how political partisans view each other and how they think the other side views them. And what we've found many times, it's always the same, is that Democrats and Republicans are in complete agreement that the other side disagrees with their side, dislikes their side, and dehumanizes their side more than twice as much as they actually do. So we are stuck in this shared illusion. Both Democrats and Republicans are equally susceptible to this. Both of us are completely convinced that the other side, again, even dehumanizes our side more than twice as much as they actually do. So what's the consequence of this? Well, if we think that they dislike, and especially if we think they dehumanize our group, then we're more likely to suggest really spiteful policies, right? We like then politicians who try to gerrymander voting districts. We say, yep, that's the right approach. We like the idea of completely shutting the other party out of any political decisions. And so it leads to, again, and it's a complete illusion. This illusion leads us to behaviors that are that erode democracy, right? And both sides, again, are doing this. This is correlated with Republicans. It's correlated with conservatism. right? So the more conservative Republicans are, the more susceptible they are to this. But in Democrats, it's correlated with liberalism. So it's not that one side is propagating this, it's both sides are equally susceptible. And again, it's based on a complete illusion. So we're all stuck in this pattern of erroneous meta perceptions. But I think the really good news about this is that unlike trying to convince somebody that they should like another group more than they do, right? You're trying to convince them, well, you're wrong about that group. You're wrong about your own mind. With meta perceptions, all you're trying to do is convince them that they're wrong about somebody else's mind. And that to me is a much easier sell. And it's proven to be in our research that it's much easier to correct negative meta perceptions than it is to correct negative perceptions. And sometimes, like we've done it with Iranians, Americans think that Iranians dislike and dehumanize America and Americans. And it's just not true. And if we just update that information to give them true factual information from surveys across the Muslim world, but particularly in Iran, if we give them that information, it corrects their negative meta perceptions and it leads them to dislike and dehumanize Iranians less in turn. So I think it's a great opportunity because, it's equal. It's a democratizing psychological bias that Democrats and Republicans both buy into, and it's equally wrong for both of them. And I think that that's interesting and somewhat delightful that it's democratizing. We have this bias because we're humans, not because of our political ideology. And so to me, it pulls us all together, this realization that we're all susceptible to the same process.
Mm-hmm. And it seems also like you're pointing us to the solutions, which I think Amanda was talking about before. If we could read that, or I saw a comment go by, if the illusion is created in part because my social media is filled with negative comments, or because what I'm choosing to read reinforces that they hate us. So there's also this way that you are all really talking about this opportunity that we have to get out of this illusion. And that, again, I think kind of brings us all the way back to this idea of contact. If I actually spent time with an Iranian, maybe I would know that that person doesn't think about me in that kind of way. So that transitions us back to Eboo. Eboo, we've been talking about like kind of moving back and forth, this dynamic sizing of these big concepts back down to this practical. I want to kind of come back and ask you about more universal principles for bridging differences. What do you see as distinctive challenges or opportunities that are more particular, perhaps to interfaith work? Can you talk about that a little bit? I hope. Yes, there you go.
Yeah, thank you. We can go back to slide number 2 on my set of slides. So I think amongst the big questions that all of us are asking is this crisis going to make us more inclusive? Can this crisis make us more inclusive? Or is it just of suffering and death? A second wave of racism and xenophobia is not far behind. In 1832, cholera epidemic. I'm getting a sign that my internet connection is unstable, friends. So I'm just letting you know that if something happens, Amanda or Allison or Emile will save me. Maybe my internet connection doesn't like what this slide is saying. But look, it's obvious that when really bad things happen, people look for folks to blame, and very often those are minority religious groups. And interestingly, very frequently in American history, the Chinese were not considered only an ethnic or a racial group, but a minority religious group. They were referred to principally as heathens or non-Christians. And of course, there are plenty of Christian communities, including Catholics, who were blamed for all sorts of ugly things. So there is a lot of history, and as Amanda and Emile have said, there's a lot of human psychology which can tend towards ugly things. And then there are also more positive stories. And so if we can go to the next slide, you can always look for the helpers. right? As Mr. Rogers said. And you can always look at the moments in which crisis brings out the best in humankind. Actually, Rebecca Solnit writes a great book on this, right? A Paradise Created in Hell, which had got a lot of attention when it came out a few years ago. And Krista Tippett just replayed her interview with Rebecca Solnit. She was like, look, the 1906 San Francisco earthquake brings out the best in lots of people. People want to help. That impulse is salient, at least at the beginning, right? And so we've got here a handful of figures and moments in history in which the crisis made people better, made them more inclusive. So Lillian Wald is a Jewish woman in the late 19th, early 20th century who really dramatically advances the field of nursing. If you grew up with a nurse in your public school, or if there's a nurse in your kid's public school, it's because of Lillian Wald. Nursing is a field because of Lillian Wald. She helps to start the first professorship of nursing at Columbia University. And during the pandemic of 1918, she starts an emergency nurses collective in which, like, waves and waves of people, mostly women, many of them not trained nurses, were involved at the bedsides of people who were suffering. She starts a settlement house called the Henry Street Settlement House. She is basically the Jane Addams figure you've never heard of. And she was Jewish, and she's inspired in no small part out of her Jewish tradition. And one of the people who volunteers as a nurse in the pandemic of 1918 and 1919 is probably my greatest hero, and that's Dorothy Day. Dorothy Day is in her early 20s at this time. She is a journalist. She can drink the artists in Greenwich Village under the table. She's kind of a wild person. And this is a deep service commitment for somebody. And she writes about in her work, she writes about how, she wrapped lots of people in sheets and sent them to the morgue. And 15 years later, she starts the Catholic worker movement during another crisis in American life, which is the Great Depression. And part of what strikes me there, and I say this to professors and students all the time, there's a long time between Dorothy Day's experience as a nurse in the pandemic of 1918 and her founding of the Catholic worker movement. I mean, it's not like people have a deep experience of service or suffering and then immediately start something necessarily. Oftentimes there's a delay. It's a formative moment, and it takes people some time to put that together into how it's going to shape their life. But Dorothy Day builds this stunning movement called the Catholic Worker, which is a faith-based movement drenched in the Catholic tradition, but I spent 2 years in it. It welcomed me as a Muslim, and it was about God expects us to serve everyone, so why don't we? Just do it, right? And it's the most stunning. If people checking out Catholic worker houses, it's just the most remarkable thing. And one of my favorite stories is an American history about how a crisis makes us more inclusive is represented by that Fort Chaplain's postage stamp. So lots of folks aren't actually aware that America thinks of itself as a Protestant nation for centuries, really. And the term Judeo-Christian is an invented term. It comes into vogue really only during World War II, and largely as a result of what's known as the Fort Chaplain's incident. So on a U.S. naval vessel that's hit by a Nazi submarine in 1943, it's called the USS Dorchester. It's chaos on board, as you can imagine. It's nighttime. The ship is going down. Sailors are running around, scared out of their minds. And these four chaplains, an evangelical Protestant, a mainline Protestant, a Jew, and a Catholic, are handing out life jackets. The life jackets run out. They take their own life jackets off, hand them to the next four sailors on board ship, link arms, say the last prayers, the last rites of their own faiths, and go down with the ship. And this becomes a signal moment of the war. And people, people who are saved recount this with tears in their eyes. And Warner Brothers makes a movie called Four Men of God. A postage stamp is made there. You can see in small letters, Interfaith in Action. That is the birth of Judeo-Christian America. And so the thing that so many of us think of as outdated, right? Like Judeo-Christian doesn't make room for atheists or Zoroastrians or Muslims, etc. It's actually a giant step forward in 1943. Would you rather have been a Jew in America in 1923 or in 1983, right? And one of the reasons is because we craft a new narrative which includes up until that time, vilified religious communities, principally Jews and Catholics. So we have that opportunity now. This crisis can make us more inclusive. And we actually have a Four Chaplains moment happening all the time in front of our faces. And I'll tell you where that is. It's in American hospitals. In every American hospital, it is just commonplace that a Muslim physician, a Muslim internist is working with a Jewish anesthesiologist, supported by a Hindu nurse in a room that is prepared by a Jehovah's Witness at a hospital that was started by a Catholic religious order run by somebody who grew up in the evangelical tradition and is now a secular humanist. That's not like the beginning of a joke or a cartoon. That's like everywhere, all the time, in literally every American hospital. That is the image of who we can be in this country. That is interfaith America, right? And one of the things I love about religious traditions is they throw down the gauntlet. They ask us the deep moral question. And so we'll go to my final slide here. The man who maybe threw it on the gauntlet better than anybody else in American history, right? Save Frederick Douglass. King, he says, look, time is neutral, right? Like time's not going to solve this. It's used destructively or constructively. So is this crisis going to make us more inclusive? Can we use this time so that America becomes more inclusive, so that we move towards interfaith America, the chapter after Judeo-Christian? It's done good work for 80 years, right? But it's time for a new chapter. It's time for interfaith America. It's time for those 10,000 bridge builders to move us ahead, or those 10 million bridge builders. And I think it starts with us. And this gathering is a launch point for big things, right? It's a Seneca Falls for our movement. So thank you to everybody who organized it. I'm going to put in the notes in the chat the new online platform for Interfaith America that we recently launched.
Mm-hmm. Thank you. You have me wanting to yell out amen, so I appreciate it. You're calling us to those kinds of spaces that resonate. And again, what we're hearing from this conversation is a combination of the role of, like, you told us a story there. You told us a story that I hadn't heard before. And actually, in the telling of that story, you even told us a story about what's going on right now that I haven't seen before. And that takes me back, Amanda, to you in terms of journalists or the right learning about how these complicated stories that are windows into hope and humanity, into progress, could be told. And I know you've been listening to things or talking about things like looping or widening the lens. I'm wondering if there's any that's coming from this conversation that you want to expand upon to really help us. Because again, we've been talking so much about storytelling, and then I have to think, where do I go for that storytelling? And I go to you, as a journalist. So what's coming to mind for you? And then we'll have you talk about this, and we've got a couple of questions that will come up after that.
Yeah, no, I mean, I think we keep circling back and mentioning contact theory. And one way that contact theory works at scale is through good storytelling, right? And that way, if you have really good storytelling, there are ways to have the effects of contact theory without forcing marginalized people to do the work of, going to summer camps with privileged people. So vicarious storytelling is really, really important. And a lot of this is on the media to do much, much, much better and more creatively. So I just want to acknowledge that. And I think, with the Solutions Journalism Network, we've been training hundreds of journalists in some specific strategies for how to induce curiosity, not only in the story or the segment end product, but in our reporting. Right. So I think that there is a lot of wonder and complexity out there, and we have to do the reporting, which involves partly knowing your own self and having the skills to acknowledge your own barriers and biases. But there are other things that I think are useful maybe in other fields. One thing is, I call it widening the lens, but the idea is, and people who study conflict know this, you can't necessarily come head on when you want to talk to people about a really contentious issue. It opens up a lot more space if you come at it sideways. So I think about widening the lens in my stories, both through time and space. So geographically and historically, and Eboo did this in telling us a story from the 1918 pandemic. It is much easier to be curious about someone else's problem, right? Than it is about one you're already really entrenched in. So instead of having a debate about the Confederate flag in the United States, or maybe in addition to doing that, you could talk about how flags are incredibly divisive symbols in many, many countries throughout all of human history, essentially. You could talk about how that operates in South Korea, in Northern Ireland, in Australia. I mean, there are lots of really interesting stories about how flags make people crazy. And so symbols, right? Sacred symbols and how they mean different things to different people. That's really interesting. And I think does incite curiosity. But sometimes you have to get outside of it and then come back. Or even better, if you do it well, people will make that connection, right? Aaron Halpern, a psychologist in Israel, has done really good work on how coming at things sideways through analogy, people will often make the connection themselves. And sometimes it's better if people do that and you don't, do it for them. So another way I think to incite curiosity is to ask different questions. A lot of you already know that, so I'm not going to say too much about that, except to say that we've been collecting. We have about 22 of these questions at Solutions Journalism Network, which we can share. That I keep some of them up on my wall. So when I'm doing a phone interview, if I end up talking to someone with whom I just really profoundly disagree, I'll just turn to the Post-it note and ask a question because it's really hard to think when you're in that situation. But if you ask different questions, you can revive curiosity. There's always more to the story, right? How many times do we have to learn that lesson? And then another thing I think that's maybe the easiest one to take away with you and do tomorrow is the power of data visualizations, infographics. So Brendan Nyhan at Dartmouth has done some good work on this. People are more likely to take in information that contradicts their deeply held beliefs if they're conveyed visually. And there are different possible theories for why that is. But I think it's because people like to feel like they came to a conclusion themselves, right? People inherently are motivated by autonomy. And so when you see a graphic depicting, the warming of the earth, that's much more powerful than some journalist telling you, or some pundit or some expert telling you about the warming of the earth. And the reason this is valuable is because you can create these infographics and you can reuse them over and over and over and share them and make them open source and that kind of thing. So newsrooms do create these graphics, but they don't do it for that reason, right? They do it because they're trying to get attention. They think they might look good. They're pretty maps. They generate engagement. And that's often because they just don't know. All right. A lot of what I think, people often blame the news media for chasing clicks, and that's all true. And there's a lot we could talk about with the business model. But a lot of it is just legacy traditions. Like, people just keep doing what they've always done. And that's true in a lot of professions, right? But that is just as, I think, damaging as some of the other problems that we talk more about in the news media.
Mm-hmm, mm-hmm. As you were beginning your conversation here, you were talking also about some of the kind of complexities in the storytelling. Like, what does it mean? Who's benefiting from this kind of story, and how? That's a bridge, I think, between what you were talking about and also what Emile was talking about. We have someone in our audience that has a question exactly about that. So I'm going to ask Katie Heighton. Hopefully I'm saying your name. So Katie, are you available to come and ask Emile or our panel your question?
Sure. I will turn on my video as well. Hi.
Hi.
This was a bit ago, so I will try to do my best to paraphrase. But I think I was interested in hearing a little bit more about the power of storytelling and perspective giving, which I think is a truly powerful kind of experience, and sometimes has the tendency to put the burden of storytelling back on those most marginalized communities, who have been oftentimes asked to do this again and again, and as Emile mentioned, without seeing much change. And so I heard a couple other people talking about incentives. What are the incentives for participation on both the people who are humbly listening? But I think for me, I'm also interested in those who are asked to tell their stories again. And how do you make that a place of hope and a place of inclusion and welcome, and not one of burden?
Emile, would you like to take this on? Oh, you unmuted yourself. Oh, you muted yourself. Let's try it again. Yeah, we got you.
Well, I think it's an outstanding question. I don't know what the answer is, though. Especially the burden placed on the marginalized community. I think Amanda has a nice point, which is that can be done through an intermediary, right? A journalist can tell the story of somebody else, and as long as they do it authentically, then maybe that can help at least spread some of the burden.
Mm-hmm. Others, Eboo or Amanda, other thoughts that you have about this particular question?
I mean, can folks hear me? Can you hear me, Allison? Okay. I mean, I think it's a great question. I think one kind of complicating thing for me is, I'm a brown guy. I'm Muslim. I'm actually part of a Muslim minority, and I guess in some ways I'm marginalized. I don't want anybody approaching me as if I'm marginalized. I don't want anybody telling me that I'm not the luckiest person in the world, which is how I think of myself, and I wonder, I mean, there are lots of categories in which that is objective, right? Educationally, et cetera. And there's other categories in which people might say, yes, but don't you, I'm going to approach you as if you're marginalized or oppressed. And I'm like, actually, please don't. And actually, for me, that's theological, right? I believe that, I have the breath of God in me. I believe everybody has the breath of God in them. I believe that the Quran is the final revelation. I believe that the Prophet Muhammad is the final prophet. I believe that Ismailis have the true living spiritual guide. The point that I make is that there's dimensions of my identity which make me feel really central to the human narrative. And I would really much prefer to be approached that way. And maybe I'm the only one, but maybe not.
Mm-hmm. Thank you for that. And I think it also is this idea too around we have to be able to ask. And I think Amanda, you were speaking about this, and I see in the chat everybody wants what those 22 questions are. But how do we engage and open up those kind of places of curiosity that, like, I'm really interested in hearing your story, Eboo, and this is not a matter of you teaching me; it's a matter of me being curious. So I think part of it is even the approach is how we engage with it. That's the therapist kind of speaking within this, but I'm sure there's some science about how to have that approach. But that also what I hear you kind of speaking to, which is what we've been talking about all along, is that even what you invoked was that your humanity, right? And that we have places of our shared humanity, and that there's value in that, and that we're not always have to be approached in terms of being one down. So part of it, I think, is asking. Go ahead.
I think it's partially humanity, but actually it's also contribution, right? Like, yeah, I'll just cite from two areas. One is community organizing, and first principle of community organizing is don't do for other people what they can do for themselves. And what's baked into that is the idea that people are really powerful. So don't show up treating them as if they're not. And the other area is athletics, right? Like, my boys play travel basketball, travel baseball, and every coach that they've had has expected really significant contribution. And it doesn't matter, honestly, where you come from or what the color of your skin is. They just expect you to contribute, and they treat you as if you are going to be the best player of the team until you prove otherwise. And I feel like there's such wisdom in approaching people as if they're going to be really significant contributors.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. Emile, I see you leaning in. I don't know if I'm overreading, but is there something you want to kind of add to that conversation?
Yeah, I do just want to share one thing. I don't want to get too stuck on this idea that's perhaps new and odd to folks of meta perceptions, but I really ran into these. I was asked to help with a situation in Kenya. The situation in Kenya is there was recurring conflict between the Muslim youth in Kenya and the anti-terrorism police. The anti-terrorism police would pick up a Muslim youth on a tip that they were going to go join al-Shabaab, and they would rough them up And then, of course, that youth's friends would know that that kid had no sympathy for al-Shabaab. And so the youth would attack the police. There was a lot of violence back and forth between these groups. And I was asked to what I thought about intervening. And what we decided to do was decided to give both sides the benefit of the doubt and assume that they thought that the other side felt more hostilely towards them than they actually did. And maybe if we could reveal this to both sides, it might have an impact. And so what we did is we just very simply had them report how they felt about Muslims and Kenyans and al-Shabaab. And we found that both of the sides were really pessimistic. The youth thought that the police really despised them, right? And the police thought that the youth were really sympathetic to al-Shabaab and didn't really see themselves as Kenyans. And both sides were completely wrong. And what we did then is we just went to them with the data. We said, look, you know what we asked you because we asked you. We asked them the same thing. Here are the results. You know, isn't it interesting? This is what you thought they would say. This is what they said. This is what they thought you would say. And this is how you actually feel. And there hasn't been any violence between the groups over the last 6 months since we did this. And I can't, you know, I'm a scientist. I can't attribute it to this without more research. But I think there's a lot of power because it's kind of low-hanging fruit, right? We have, as humans, we have this pessimism bias. So we know that people are going to think that the other side thinks worse of them than they actually do. So it's something that we can kind of predict. And, you know, I feel like if we can short circuit this before people enter into dialogue, maybe it could make that dialogue go more smoothly, right? Because you're tripped up with the other group because of how you think they think of you. Mm-hmm. And if they don't actually think that, that's a really silly reason for a dialogue to go off the tracks, right?
Yeah. Well, even this kind of, I think what you're doing for us here is even raising that as an awareness. So now I have a metacognition about my metacognition, right? So that I can go into this place. I'm like, is this the moment that I'm thinking that you don't like me more than I think of, you know? So even that is a way, like, and maybe there's an infographic that Amanda can help us with that kind of does that. But you all are pointing to that. There are so many questions coming in. I want to move to the next one, which is Serena Bayan. Serena, are you ready for your question?
Yes, hello. Let me just start my video again. Hi, thank you so much everyone for such a great conversation. So my question was related to, and for Eboo primarily, and it's really for everyone, and a question around the intergenerational opportunity for this bridging work. And I would just love to hear more about how it seems like not just young people are sitting in idleness and wanting to work towards idealism, but so many generations as well. So I would love to hear your perspective on if there's an opportunity to do that with your work as well.
Yeah, well, I mean, thank you so much for that. I mean, I think that's absolutely correct. I think that's absolutely correct. And, you know, part of this is just, part of the reason I presented the way that I did is just kind of the idiosyncrasies of nonprofit organizations, which is they tend to work in particular sectors and spheres, and IFYC works largely with residential campuses and kind of the 18 to 22-year-old range. So this isn't, I don't want to say anything essentialist. What I'm saying is not necessarily essentialist. It is more, here is an initiative that we are launching within a sector that we know well and we think we have an impact in. If there's other people who either work within this sector and want to have an impact on this with us, we'd love that. And if there's folks who are like, man, I can think about 10 bridge builders working with people who are on their encore careers, right? I think that's awesome also. And I love if your big idea is, so how do we do 10,000 bridge builders in each of those generations and do 10 million bridges between them, right? So long story short, what I offer wasn't essentialist about 16 to 24-year-olds say. It's more just the territory that we happen to tread as an organization.
Okay, great. Eboo, I just wanted to flag that we lost some of your words there. So we're going to be looking for opportunities to kind of tap back into some of your resources later. The mic is kind of going in and out just a little bit. But I think we heard, you know, part of what I want to kind of rephrase that I heard just so folks could kind of hear it as well is that that seemed to be the kind of the wheelhouse that you all had, was having access and having that kind of proximity to that kind of group. And there's still always this kind of invitation to kind of do and kind of do more. So we have only a few more minutes left up, but I want to make sure that I kind of come back, give everybody their equal chance. Amanda, just giving you maybe 1 minute to kind of think a little bit about what you kind of heard or what you want to walk us away with. And then I have one small note that we have to make before we wrap up. So Amanda, anything that you wanted to kind of contribute?
Yeah, I mean, I think you talked and we've all kind of talked about listening, and I want to maybe end on that note because I almost wish there was a better word for listening. I feel like it's kind of overused and cliched, and I don't think most of us know how to do it very well. I know I didn't. I mean, I was a professional interviewer at, major publications, and I thought I was good at it, and when I started doing really good, I did some conflict mediation training with the Center for Understanding in Northern California. And what you realize is that listening isn't just about acting like you're listening, right? But it's about proving that you've heard the person. And in that process, like if you actually want to prove you've heard them, then you're forced to be more curious. So it's like this feedback loop of good things, right? And whereas before, when I would interview people, I would sort of nod and smile and do this kind of thing. And I felt like I was listening. Now I'm thinking about how can I take what I heard you say, what seemed most important to you, and resetting the table trains on this as well, and re-articulate it in my most elegant language and play it back to you, and then ask you if I got it right with actual curiosity. And what I find is that people really, first of all, if you got it right, they just light up. They always say the same thing. They say, exactly. And it's such a wonderful moment. And it makes the process of journalism feel a little less extractive, because it is extractive, right? But if I can at least really try to understand someone, that's one small thing I can do, right? And then the other thing that happens is they'll correct you if you didn't get it right. And that happens more than we expect. So there's an old quote, the biggest problem in communication is thinking it happened, right? Like we totally overestimate our ability to convey what we're thinking. And so when we think we get it, we don't always, or it's hard to convey. Like most people, they have not always talked about these things 1,000 times. And so if you say to them, well, what I heard you say is that, you don't want to be essentialist in how you talk about age groups. Is that right? And they say, well, it's not just that I don't want to be essentialist. It's that I might be wrong, and I want to be humble, right? Now you've gotten to something more true and actually more interesting. So there's a researcher in Israel named Guy Ichikov who does really cool research on how listening changes what people say. So once people feel heard, they say more coherent, subtle, revealing things. And so it's particularly obvious why this would be good for journalism, but I think it's good for everything. They say less extreme things. And the opposite is true. When people don't feel heard, which I would argue is in 90% of interviews, they say more and more extreme things. And so we can see where that leads. So I think many of you here are experts in listening, but that's something that I would really, if I were starting a civilization from scratch on Mars, I would really zoom in on focusing on how do we teach the best listening skills we can to children from a very young age and all the way through the lifespan.
I mean, so Emile, I see you. Go ahead.
Yeah, I mean, it's not really necessary, but there's the data I have to back up what Amanda is saying is from that study with Israelis and Palestinians. That is, Palestinians changed in their attitudes towards Israelis when they were listened to by Israelis. But I think even more interesting is the amount of change was correlated with how well they felt heard, not with how sympathetic they thought their Israeli partner was to Palestinians, but how well they thought they performed their job of listening. Mm-hmm. And so I think it's right. It by itself is a really powerful act.
Thank you, panelists, for speaking to this. I think we've moved from the framing of the issue and the problem, how we think about contact. It's not just bringing bodies together, but how it is that we really hear. You all are preaching to the converted as far as the therapist here, which, I spend hours trying to teach people how to listen, and then I have to listen too. So I think we all have these different pathways to our listening. Educators, you have to listen to what your students are asking. What do you need? And also, I think as John Powell kind of talked about before, is how do we listen to ourselves in all of this? Listen to those chords. So it's a beautiful way for us to think about what we can do and how we can actually make this current unfolding disaster bend us towards an arc of justice, and bend us toward an arc of good. I think you've pointed us in that direction. Thank you all for participating. Sorry we couldn't get to all of the comments. There's lots here. I want to remind all of our participants that we're going to go ahead and take a break. When you come back, please come back and go to your separate breakout rooms. I think you all know what that means. There should be some flagging for that, but you will go back into your breakout room. So take a break, coming back, and thank you all just for what I'm leaving with, which is some hope, which I needed. Thank you.
Thanks, Allison. I just wanted to jump in as well and thank Allison, everyone join me in thanking Allison for her moderation, and also wanted just to call your attention to the slide up here now, that this is the trickiest perhaps part of the day, technologically speaking, in that to maximize the opportunities in the Zoom rooms for the breakouts, it requires going to a separate room. So you're going to have a link in your email already, a reminder that's just come to you within the last hour with your link to your own breakout. You're going to go to that room, and then at the end of the breakout, we'll give you this link back again to navigate you back to this room when the breakout is over. So your interactive breakout session will start in just about an hour, 1 o'clock Pacific time, and then after that, we'll come back and meet as a full group back in this room. So enjoy your break, and thank you again to Allison and Emile and Eboo and Amanda for your time and all of your great work and sharing some of it with us today. Thanks. Enjoy your break.